Life can change in an instant. And sometimes, the people you trust the most can turn into your worst enemies. This is the story of Daniel, who, after his father's sudden death, found himself betrayed by his stepmother. With everything he thought was his at risk, Daniel uncovers shocking truths about his father's will, his stepmother's deceit, and the lengths she would go to for power and money. What follows is a journey of revenge, justice, and reclaiming what's rightfully his. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's life story. My name is Daniel. I've always been close to my father. The kind of relationship that felt unshakable. After my mother passed away when I was only 6, it had always just been the two of us. My dad was a good man. He wasn't rich by any means, but he worked tirelessly to make sure I had everything I needed. I never felt deprived, not even once. I remember how he would always find time for me, even after a long day of work, sitting with me on the porch or at the dinner table, talking about life. He was my rock, my teacher, my provider. His presence was a constant source of stability in my world. We weren't a family of extravagant wealth, but we had a strong sense of love and care for one another. Life seemed to have a rhythm: work, laughter, quiet evenings together. Then, things started changing when he met Megan. At first, she seemed charming, too charming. In fact, she knew how to make people adore her almost immediately. And for a time, I thought she might be good for my dad. They got married when I was in high school, and I went along with it, never really questioning much. After all, my dad was happy, and I wasn't about to spoil that. But soon after the wedding, the mask slipped. Megan, despite her outward warmth, made it painfully clear that I was a burden to her, an inconvenience that had to be tolerated. She treated me like I was just a guest in her own home. And over time, I saw how much her presence changed the dynamic between us. My dad seemed content, but the growing tension between Megan and me was unmistakable. I kept my distance, focusing on school and later work. But something inside me told me to be wary. Still, I didn't want to make my father's life more complicated, so I kept quiet. When I was in my 20s, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. It was the kind of cancer that moves quickly, stealing breath before you can even grasp the reality of it. I dropped everything, moved back in with him, and took care of him as best as I could. Megan, however, was another story. I can still remember the stark contrast between the two of us during those dark months. I was the one who took him to chemotherapy, who sat with him through the appointments, and who held his hand when he could no longer speak. Megan, on the other hand, acted as if playing the part of the grieving wife was the most exhausting task in the world. She would disappear for hours, making excuses about errands or appointments, while I was left managing everything. She seemed to care more about spending my dad's money than about his well-being. I can't tell you how it felt to watch her live her life while I struggled to help him breathe. But I never said a word. I didn't want to create any more friction, especially with my father in such a fragile state. And then, just like that, he was gone. The day he passed away still feels like it happened just yesterday. Even though years have gone by, the grief was almost suffocating. But in a way, it was also a strange kind of relief for him. He had fought so hard, and now he could finally rest. But the relief didn't last long. It was only hours after we buried him that Megan, as cold as stone, turned to me and said, "You need to pack your things and get out." At first, I thought she was joking, a cruel attempt to provoke me during a moment of deep sorrow. I laughed, thinking there was no way she could be serious. But her face was as cold as ice. She didn't flinch. "This house is mine now," she said. "You're an adult, figure it out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. She had just buried my father, and now she was kicking me out of my own home. I couldn't bring myself to accept it, so I tried to argue. "This is my home too," I protested, but my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. She didn't say another word. She stormed off, only to return moments later with a trash bag. She started throwing my clothes into it like they were worthless, like they meant nothing. In that moment, everything about her felt like a betrayal, a heartless attempt to erase me from the life my father and I had shared for so many years. I grabbed my things from her hands. desperate not to lose my connection to the life I had built with my dad. But she sneered, eyes filled with contempt. You think I can't do this? She spat. Your father left everything to me. The house, the bank accounts, everything. There's nothing here for you. I stood there, my heart heavy with disbelief. As she went on, her words cutting deeper with every sentence, I was shaken to my core, unsure of what to do next. This wasn't just about a house or possessions, it was about the person I thought I knew. The woman who had been part of my life for years. And yet, in that moment, she was nothing like the person I had tried to believe in. She was a stranger, someone who had just thrown me out into the world, with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered heart. I spent that night sitting on the porch, my back pressed against the cold wood, a small suitcase by my side and the weight of the world in my chest. The house I had known my whole life felt like a prison now. The walls closing in with every passing second. I couldn't sleep, my mind kept racing, replaying every conversation I'd had with my father over the years, trying to remember if he'd ever said anything that would prepare me for this moment. I was on my own now, and everything felt uncertain. I kept running through the words Megan had said, it's mine now. The claim seemed so final, so complete. She was taking it all. But something didn't sit right. My father had always been meticulous about everything. He was responsible, well organized. He had to have thought about this, especially given the way Megan had treated me in recent years. But was he really that thoughtful? Did he leave me with nothing? My mind kept spinning in circles. And by the morning, I knew I had to find out for sure. I went to see Mr. Reynolds, my father's lawyer, the man who had handled all of my dad's affairs for as long as I could remember. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew I needed answers. When I walked into his office, he was already expecting me. It was almost as though he had been waiting for this moment. I was expecting you, Mr. Reynolds said, his voice calm but with a hint of sympathy. He slid a thick envelope across the desk toward me. I took it with trembling hands, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no turning back now. Inside the envelope was a letter from my father. The paper felt heavy, almost as if it carried the weight of the words written on it. As I read, I could feel my breath catch in my throat. My father had foreseen everything. The letter was addressed to me, and it was clear that he knew Megan would try to take everything from me as soon as he was gone. Daniel, if you're reading this, then Megan has shown her true colors sooner than I expected. I know she will try to take everything from you, but I made sure she can't. The house is not hers. The accounts are not hers. Everything she thought she inherited is, in fact, yours. Reynolds will explain the details. Stand tall, son. Don't let her push you out of what is rightfully yours. The words hit me like a thunderclap. I blinked at the letter, my hands shaking, a mixture of disbelief and relief flooding through me. Megan had lied. She had no claim to anything. The house, the bank accounts, everything was mine. My father had made sure of it. Reynolds confirmed what the letter said. Your father was ahead of her. He explained. He transferred the house and all assets into a trust under your name before he passed. Megan gets an allowance, but that's been revoked due to her actions. I felt a sense of vindication, but it was tempered by a deep, gnawing anger. Megan had lied to my face. She had manipulated me, trying to make me believe she had inherited everything. But now I had the proof. My father's foresight had protected me. I wasn't just angry at her for what she did. I was furious at how she'd used my father's death to take advantage of me. She's going to lose it, I muttered under my breath, already picturing her reaction. Reynolds smiled faintly. She already has. I left his office with the documents in hand, a quiet fury growing inside me. It wasn't just about the house. It wasn't about the money. This was about Megan's betrayal. The way she had tried to erase me from my own life. The thought of confronting her filled me with a quiet determination. I wasn't going to back down. This was my inheritance, my life, and I was ready to take it back. When I returned to the house, I wasn't the same person who had left just a few hours earlier. I was calm, but there was a steel edge to my resolve. Megan was standing on the porch when I pulled into the driveway, sipping her overpriced coffee like everything was still in her control. When she saw me, Her smug expression faltered just for a second. But she quickly masked it. I thought I made myself clear, she said, crossing her arms as if she had the upper hand. I stepped onto the porch, the envelope from my father's lawyer in hand. I handed it to her without saying a word. This is from my father, I said, my voice steady. You might want to read it. She snatched it from me and began reading. I watched her face as she skimmed the words, her smug expression slowly slipping away. Her eyes grew wider, and I could see the panic building in her. She read it again, and then her hand started to shake. That's not real, she shouted, crumpling the letter in her fist. He wouldn't do this to me. I remained calm, watching her unravel. I pulled out a second envelope, the official paperwork from Mr. Reynolds. It's all here, the house, the bank accounts, everything. You own nothing, Megan. In fact, you're trespassing on my property. For a moment, she froze, her face twisted in disbelief. Then, without warning, she lunged at me, her perfectly manicured nails aimed straight for my face. I barely had time to react before she shoved me backward, screaming like a wild animal. This is my house, she screamed. I was his wife. You are nothing. I grabbed her wrists, forcing her back a step. My voice was firm but calm. You need to leave, Megan. Her eyes darted around like she was searching for a way out. But there was no escape. This was reality. The house, the money, everything she thought she owned was mine. And she wasn't going to take it from me. For a moment, she just stared at me, her rage still bubbling just below the surface. Then, something changed. Her expression shifted, and a slow smile crept onto her face. The kind of smile I had seen before when she was about to do something manipulative. You think you've won? She said, smoothing her dress as if the situation were under her control. You really think this is over? I didn't answer. I simply stepped aside and pointed toward the driveway. Get out. She didn't move. Instead, her gaze narrowed, and she said, You can't just throw me out like a stray dog. I have nowhere to go. I couldn't help but laugh. A sharp, bitter sound. You threw me out less than 24 hours after my father died. Don't expect me to feel sorry for you. Her eyes narrowed again, and without another word, she stormed inside. The confrontation wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But it felt like the first real victory I had. The battle was just beginning. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating incessantly on the nightstand. Groggy, I reached for it, still processing the events of the day before. As soon as I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. I had a flood of missed calls and messages from unfamiliar numbers. But what caught my eye was the influx of notifications from family members, some of whom I hadn't spoken to in years. There were also messages from reporters, their names making my skin crawl. One of the first messages I opened made my blood run cold. You should be ashamed of yourself. Throwing your grieving stepmother onto the street. Your father would be disgusted. I felt a sickening weight in my chest as I clicked on a link someone had sent me. It led to an article with a headline that made my skin crawl. Millionaire's greedy son evicts heartbroken widow days after husband's death. The article was nothing short of a smear campaign. It painted Megan as the devoted wife who had stuck by my father's side during his illness, while I was portrayed as a cold, ungrateful son who had thrown her out in the middle of her grief. The worst part? The article included a picture of me at the funeral, looking distant, as if I had no empathy for my father's passing, paired with a staged image of Megan sitting on a suitcase, fake tears streaming down her face. The lies were so well crafted that people were believing them. The comments section was filled with people calling me a monster. Even family members I had trusted turned on me, siding with Megan and accusing me of being selfish and cruel. My heart pounded as I read the article, the weight of it settling on me like a heavy stone. Megan had acted quickly, manipulating the media to paint herself as the victim. She had done this before. I was sure of it. But now she was using the public to get the upper hand. I couldn't just sit back and let her get away with this. She was trying to ruin me. She wanted to destroy everything my father had left me. She had no idea what she had just triggered. But I did. I had to fight back. And I wasn't going to let her win. Then, as if on cue, another notification popped up. A lawsuit. Meghan was suing me for the house. The inheritance. Everything she believed was hers. She was going for it all. Using the media to gain public sympathy. And now she was going to try and take everything from me through the courts. I knew she was desperate. And I knew that her lies had a solid grip on the public. But I had something she didn't. I had proof. Something she couldn't possibly have predicted. The house was in a trust under my name. And she couldn't touch it. But she was banking on the courts and the media believing her lies. She wasn't going to win. I rushed back to Mr. Reynolds' office. My mind whirling with the realization that this wasn't just about inheritance or assets. Meghan wasn't just going for the house. She was trying to ruin my reputation. Destroy my father's legacy. And leave me with nothing. When I arrived, Reynolds had already received word about the media circus Meghan had unleashed. He wasn't surprised, but there was something new in his expression, a quiet resolve. "You've seen the news?" he asked. "I've seen it," I muttered, gritting my teeth. "And I'm not going to let her get away with it." Reynolds nodded, leaning back in his chair. "She's banking on public sympathy. She knows she can't win in court. But she'll try to make your life miserable in the process." I clenched my jaw. "Is there anything we can use to shut this down? Anything that proves what she really is?" Reynolds didn't say a word for a moment. Then he stood up, walked to a drawer, and pulled out a thick envelope. "This," he said, sliding it across the desk. "This is something your father never told her about." I opened the envelope, my hands shaking as I began to flip through the documents inside. There were legal papers, bank statements, transaction records, and something else. Something that made my blood run cold. It was a private investigator's report. "Your father had started to suspect something was off with Meghan," Reynolds explained, his voice quieter now, "so he hired someone to look into her." Towards the end of his life, I felt a chill run down my spine as I read through the findings. Meghan had been cheating on my father for years. The report showed not one affair, but several. Some of them had even been funded with my father's money, siphoned into secret accounts while he was too ill to notice. The depth of her betrayal was staggering. But it wasn't just that. There was also something else, something my father had planned. A prenup. Meghan didn't know about it. But it existed. My father had set it up before they married, ensuring that if she ever betrayed him, if she ever cheated, or did anything shady, she would walk away with nothing. I stared at the document, my mind reeling. "She has no idea about this, does she?" I asked. Reynolds smirked. "Not a clue." I exhaled sharply. This was it. This was the proof I needed to shut everything down. To expose her for who she really was. It was game over for Meghan. With the documents in hand, I left Reynolds' office. This time, there was no fear in my chest, only the cold determination to make things right. Meghan had gone to the media first, thinking it would shield her. But now I had the ultimate weapon, and I was going to use it. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. I knew this battle wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about my father's legacy. The truth, and ensuring that Meghan's lies would no longer hold any power over me. I made some calls to journalists who actually cared about facts, not sensationalism, and to my father's true friends, those who knew the man he truly was. With the evidence I had gathered, it didn't take long for everything to unravel. The next morning, a new article was published. This one told the truth. Grieving widow or heartless scammer? The truth about Meghan's affairs and stolen fortune. The details were shocking. The secret bank accounts, the affairs, and the evidence of her manipulation. It went viral within hours. The media that had once turned against me now tore Meghan to shreds. People who had condemned me as a villain now saw her for what she truly was. A fraud. A liar. And a thief. But the real blow came when a fraud investigation was launched. The stolen money wasn't just used for her selfish whims. It had been funneled into illegal schemes. The IRS got involved. And Meghan's carefully crafted world of luxury came crashing down. A few days later, Meghan showed up at my door, looking nothing like the confident woman she once was. Her hair was a mess. Her designer clothes wrinkled, and she looked utterly defeated. She tried one last media tour, crying that I had set her up. But no one believed her anymore. The truth was out, and it had destroyed her. Megan was arrested, tried, and convicted. The charges were serious: fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. She was sentenced to prison, and the last of her wealth was seized. It was over. As for me, I reclaimed my father's house. I renovated it, making sure to honor his memory in every corner. The money she stole was donated to cancer research and shelters, causes my father would have supported. Her name will always be tied to fraud. But my father's legacy lives on. And as I walked through the grocery store one day, years later, I saw her, Megan, older, broken, her pride gone. She saw me, too, but instead of confronting me, she turned and fled, a coward to the end. I didn't need to say a word. She knew. She had lost. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories.